question of narrative is basically who do we tell, what do we tell ourselves about why we do things, who we are, and a lot of our identity is nothing more than the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so, what are the stories, or what is the narrative that connects us with our landscape, with the land? And so, we did a whole lot of interviews. We asked people about how they connect with landscape. And what was very interesting to me was that a lot of people actually don't have the concept of landscape in their life. They have the concept of property. That's what I own, and you better get out of there. And otherwise, it's other people's land, and I'm not connected to that. And that was something that, for me as a German immigrant, was somewhat of a surprise, because the German idea of home is always landscape, house, and community. And when I ask people here about their concept of home, it's normally my property and what I own. And so it's a very different narrative that I was confronted with. And not everybody is like that. People have very different narratives about their relationship with the land. Some people believe that land should be accessible, that it should be enjoyable by everybody. But a lot of people just don't have that concept. So that was a really interesting learning experience. And so we wanted to do public outreach, talk with community leaders, engage businesses, organizations. And this slide hasn't been changed since we started the project, and it's been tricky. I don't want to talk too much about that, but I realized that there's a lot more conflicts. Like we were trying to build a landscape alliance, and there's basically a lot of conflicts about people who work towards the land. And it starts off with ecological farmers being disconnected to conservation groups, because most conservation groups, their staff lives in the urban centers, and a lot of them are vegan. And ecological farmers really like grazing. So there's like those conflict areas that makes it difficult to work together. Well, the climate change movement really likes biofuels, but it's driving landscape degradation, and the conservation groups don't like that. So there's all of those areas of conflict, which normally we don't talk about, because we are kind of staying in separate silos. And that was one of the experiences, and I don't think right now it's possible to overcome those silos. I think we're so deep in that we cannot superficially create an alliance. However, what we can do is we can practice regeneration together. And this is how this idea of tiny forests came up with us. I'm starting this talk about tiny forests with two questions of why tiny forests. And the first one I summarize as that a focus on technology without a shift in our values will create corrupt monster climate policy and climate action that create planetary disasters. Quick statement, and explain now why. I've heard quite a lot that sustainable technologies can mitigate the climate crisis. The expectation is that as we introduce sustainable technologies, we'll bring down emissions and the human footprint on ecosystems. But there was just a recent study that basically showed we are actually much better in sustainable technologies than we expected a few years ago. The problem is that the emissions are going up, where the prediction was with this amount of technologies available at this price, should be going down. Because we're not substituting technologies, we're just adding more. And in some areas, it's even per person. And one of my neighbors, he just bought a house from Toronto. He's putting a heat pump, but he's still living in his house in Toronto that he's heating. So he just added a second house that he's with sustainable technologies. But by adding your footprint, the technologies get undone. So the point there is, that's an article in the Atlantic. One huge contradiction is undoing our best climate efforts. Worth reading. It has also scientific citation. The second myth is that trade and carbon will direct our efforts towards the most emission intensive, or it'll move us to the least emission intensive industries, and it'll help reduce emissions. The reality that we've seen in the last years is that trade is mostly fostering international accounting loopholes. And right now, Canada is clear-cutting the tundra forest, selling the wood pellets to Britain, who has refurbished a coal plant into a wood pellet plant and gets tradable carbon emission credit for buying our clear-cut forest. This is not, like, trade by itself is not changing our human impact. The third one, and that's something that I know since 2001 because I worked into the CAP program. My boss called it CAP because he said, that's the one thing that's important. And he says only an emission cap can reduce emissions. Only if we reduce emissions, we actually reduce emissions. And the reality is that the international politics and our individual desires make it terribly difficult to create an emission cap. And it's not just the politicians, it's also the desires. Because when we get visitors who come for Christmas, they give us the plastic bomb. I had this discussion and someone said, well, yeah, the children have the right to have a positive experience of Christmas. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't have to give them plastic baths. Yeah. But there's this thinking is, I grew up with the plastic bath, and that's what was kind of fun, like popping all the plastic wrapping. And so we're continuing that, and that's maintaining culture, but it's maintaining the wrong culture. So all of what I'm listing here has nothing to do with technology. Keeping up with the Joneses is a real, keeps us in high impact. Gifting our children a sense of normal, if we grew up in the golden 80s, maybe not the right thing. And so we are continuing our focus on economic growth. Quickly want to run through this because it's important for Bruce Peninsula, I believe. One example of this is ethanol, corn ethanol. I'm measuring this in emission intensity compared to gasoline. So ethanol has about 50% of the emission intensity of gasoline, if you only count direct emission from its production. However, if agriculture is expanding because we are adding more land to the agricultural land use, then we have to convert new land into agricultural land. And then the emission intensity of ethanol is actually 120% of gasoline. And if we have a 10% ethanol mix, if you only have direct emissions, you're at 95%, so you have 5% less emissions in the mix. But if you simply add land to the agricultural landscape, it's worse than gasoline. Context matters. And this is the study that came out that measured the indirect impact. And if you look at foreign land use, actually in the entire agricultural sector, that's what changes. Everything else, even animal feedlot feed, relatively constant. But ethanol is what really set up the agricultural market and disrupted the market. So, and if you want to look at Iowa, for example, is a big corn producer. They have 50 to 70% of their corn goes into ethanol now. This is not a minor thing. It's a massive land use monster. And all the rest is like pig feed and cattle feed, highly processed food. Ontario just put out a regulation to increase ethanol from 30, increase the use of 30% of the corn for ethanol to something like 50%, which means it's taking away corn from feed, which means we're going to put a lot more land into corn. And that's what we can see nowadays. This is Ontario Regulation 1345/98, passed in 2018, and nobody talked about it, but it legislates. Farmers don't like government, don't they? Unless the government regulates to put corn into gasoline. So we have this great climate policy, which just creates another monster. I don't want to talk about it. There's irrigation water issues with ethanol. They're like 8 bushels of corn and either give you 20 gallons of ethanol fuel mixed.
I can't see the screen.
Can feed a person for an entire day. So they're real ethical questions. And yeah, there's a law that the government in Canada, its EU regulation says indirect land use changes will not be accounted for in calculating the life cycle carbon emissions of fuel at this time. This law can change. And by changing that, we can break corn ethanol in the provinces because this is federal accounting standard. And this is something that I'm working on right now. But the point I'm making is pro-environmental policies are not helping us in the climate crisis if we don't do it from the right values. And now I just said the big word, values. Most of us talk about technologies and carbon trade. Very few people talk about a shift in values. But without that shift in values, you're screwed. And the question from that arises, how do we create a shift in values? And that basically means, how do you get out of those desires and longings and identity things that we think we really need to be happy, that still are echoing from the 80s when the Earth was great and we could just expand. And that shift to sustainable values is very difficult to establish, and people don't like talking about it. There's no jobs in it, a lot of jobs and technologies. There's no fame in it because it's tough work. So this is my first point. Why tiny forests? Because we need to start thinking about values. And the second one is climate change is most often talked about as as driven by carbon dioxide emissions, whereas land use driven heat islands also are climate change. Land use makes climate change. This is a global map of the temperature anomaly of this last July. And what you can see is that most of the oceans are warming. This has nothing to do with human land use. This is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is warming the oceans. But what happens on land Look at this picture. 2 roads, same day, same city, same time. 37 degrees air temperature versus 27. There's 10 degrees difference on an afternoon. This is not the daily average, because the night may actually be cooler up here. Like that's desert climate. So if you look at the daily average, that kind of levels out. But if you are a bug or a homeless person, it surely makes a difference in which road you are. It's 10 degrees different. And we don't talk about this as climate change. But for me, this is also climate change. We can talk about this as a heat island, as an urban heat island. And again, we're talking about 5 to 8 degrees temperature difference during the day. Again, night, that all levels out a little bit. It's a bit more complex, and it's not the same if it's clouded, and it's not the same in winter. But during a sunny day, this truly makes a difference. Greenbelt is 5 degrees cooler in summer than Toronto. This is where we need the greenbelt. All of this is kind of wacky science because the IPCC does not talk about it. The IPCC has a mandate to talk about the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on the climate, does not have a mandate to talk about the impact of land use change on the climate. That's a political reason. We can talk about that later. But so the IPCC kind of hammers this message: emissions make climate change. But the other side, this is from a pilot's manual. Pilots have to deal with this all the time. If you are here under a plowed field, it's great. It's almost like an urban heat island, right? Same. It's dead, kind of like concrete. So it creates these great lifts and thermal uplift, whereas those wetlands, planes crash if they don't get this. Convert this wetland into a field. This is climate change that we're creating. And but this is the North American heat dome that developed also sometime, I think 3 years ago. And it was like heat domes are kind of like urban heat islands at continental scale. And this is very much driven by desertification here in the prairies. And it creates this self-stabilizing, the dome just stuck. So what happens is that the winds from the Arctic, they can't enter, but the jet streams get pushed up far north into the sea. This is partly global warming, but partly it's land use. You actually don't know the exact percentage of those. It's not always the same. But what the point I want to make here is on land use makes climate. And we should never, ever forget that in this climate debate. And I think it's one of the big things of the climate movement is that it makes us forget about the value of land use for protecting us or for keeping the climate cool. Heat domes come on all continents that were heavily influenced by the British. This is Australia. Australia is one of the most desertified continents with agricultural practices. And so they are dealing with heat domes quite a bit. And most of Australia used to be green, savanna green, when the British arrived. They were talking about all these paradise-like landscapes that are all now desertified. And this is, well, the Sahara is a bit older. Would be kind of moving to the British. But we have, in the past 40 years, we have lost 1/3 of farmable land through desertification, agricultural practices, the plow, chemicals, or chemicals. And this has dehydrated landscape, and it also removes vegetative cooling. I haven't talked about why it's actually warmer. Um, this is the reason why the temperature difference is it's partly shade, but shade is only a fairly small element. Mostly it's transpiration of water. So you have an air conditioning unit, you have a condenser and an evaporator. And this is the evaporator. The condenser is somewhere up in the clouds. So what basically vegetation does is take heat energy, evaporates it, and puts it out up into the sky where it goes into space. So it's a really effective way to remove heat from the earth. This is why vegetation is cooling. It has to do with the cycling of water. This is a picture from Ontario. So we sometimes think desertification, that's a Sahel thing. It's an India thing. In 1905, when agriculture was pushed really intensively, Ontario experienced a dust bowl. And I've talked with a lot of farmers who fear this happening again, just because the way we are farming nowadays. And so this is not just an other people's problem. This can become a problem right here. We're actually on the verge where it can really become a problem, like on the edge. And but on the other hand is we are not a desert. We have replanted, we have gotten together, we have understood, and we have put in a 2 billion tree program that has protected us from the desert and that has reversed the dust. And that's the really good news, because with this emission trading, I'm actually quite pessimistic that that will lead anywhere. But this thing is something that the Ontarians did as a community in a few years, and they vegetated Ontario plus southern. And that's something we should actually be really proud of, because we can. And yes, long time, what's the time?
41.
Okay. How long do you want me to speak?
Would expect maybe 45 minutes. Does that work for you?
Another 45 or total?
Total.
Okay, cool.
But you started late, so.
Okay, I start to be done in around 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
Cool. And for me, this is really the important part: is why do
Rod, can you hear me?
Because it cools the climate. And the second reason is because it helps.
Rod Lehman.
Here you can see a forest and how it creates this cloud system that is cooling the area. This is a tropical picture. This is a tundra picture. Same. Vegetation controls the water. If we remove the vegetation, the water goes. And we get into a desert condition. And this was is very much the idea of Japanese forester Miyawaki, and he was thinking, how can we reforest faster? And what we see here is basically the succession of the forest. If you just create bare soil, then eventually you have a few weeds, you have like shrubs and grasses, and then eventually you get the early pioneer species, and eventually get the climate forest. This takes 150 years, 200 years. We don't have that time anymore. And so what he figured out is put that and start right here. And we do that by planting or by prepping soil, by skipping and then planting very densely late succession species, trees. And he has done that in Japan, and he had figured out that you can create conditions where the trees push each other. And most of them die. You have to basically plant about 1 per square foot, maybe one per every 3 or 4 square feet. But that's way denser than any forester would ever plant a plantation. A plantation is every 3 meters, you plant 1 tree. So they're basically slamming trees into those. And that creates like a hyper competition between trees. But the trees are used to that because that happens in a mature forest. If a tree falls down, it creates an opening, and then it creates a race. And that's what trees are used to. So we are basically in a tiny forest creating this race if once a tree falls over. And that's the Miyawaki principle. He has planted a whole lot of them in Japan. He then got picked up in India, where in 5 years that can grow like 10-meter high forest. Like, it's amazing. Different ecosystem than Bruce Peninsula. So we won't beat the tropical speeds, but it's being done in Netherlands, and so we're basically trying this concept here in Wiarton, and because a lot of people have started planting, there's a group IVN. It's somewhere visible. No, it's not visible here, but they have basically created a brand name or a trademark, tiny forest. And they say you have to have a certain amount of soil that you add. You have to put a fence around it so that people don't trample it. And you have to involve community, you have to give children, and you have to create something like this where you have an educational area. And because a tiny forest is nothing, it's not a tool to cool the climate. It's a tool to change our value and teach how to change the climate landscape. The Miyawaki forest has about 10 times the growth rate of the same trees if you just plant them normally. You tend to choose 100% native species, late succession trees, so not mainly conifers. It has about 30 times CO2 sequestration rates than a normal forest planting. And it also choose 30 times denser planting than normal forest planting. We don't have to go into this video, but there's if you just Google tiny forest or Miyawaki forest, you'll find a few videos online, including one on the Regenerate Grey Bruce website on the Wiarton. We have a documentary that's 10 minutes. Yeah, what you do is you start by choosing your species. What we did in Wiarton, we chose that most of them are local native species, but about a third of the area is also planted in Carolinian species as part of assisted migration. When those trees will be mature in 20 years, very likely we will have a Carolinian climate here. And yeah, then you have to prepare the site, prepare the soil, continue planting. They say 4 trees for every square meter. The numbers kind of vary, as many as possible. And then the important part, maintenance and monitoring. Most people look at tree planting a little bit like making children. It's like, you stick it in, and you're done. You walk away. And
doesn't work that way with kids.
Doesn't work that way. And it's much more work in maintaining those trees, and that's also where the values like the sticking them in the ground is actually doesn't take much value. It's an instant gratification thing. But watering them and maintaining them and feeding them, that's actually where we transmit value here. Bunch of different designs. You can do them in all kinds of sizes and design. The requirement is that there's one 200 square meter connected area. That's kind of the trademark requirement. And it can't be a connected area that's just a 1 meter long stretch. That would be called a tree line. So it has to be a minimum width, I think 4 or 5 meters. I call it labor. I don't call it because I think, yes, people have to recognize ecosystem regeneration includes physical labor, and that's good. And optimally, you should build mentorship networks. You should find financial support. Yeah, all the soil prep and mulching, 3 years of mulching to keep the weeds down. We did many more than 2 waterings. I think we had a pretty rough year because it was really dry in spring and really windy in the Wiarton school. So we had to water every 2 weeks and eventually get a bit less afterwards. We didn't need to weed because we had enough mulch. This was a project. Sorry, there's an I missing, Milwaukee. Anyway, the project at the Peninsular Shores District School was a collaboration between regenerate breakers. That was basically a project hosted by the Sustainability Project. But we had financial support through stewardship breakers, through the Wiarton Rotary Club, who were looking for an environmental project. And we got funding through the Friends of the Environment. We had a total of about $20,000 for the project. This is how the school looked like. And for the rest, you'll just see pictures. Basically, a huge, very exposed building. This is a south-facing wall. So you can imagine how it heats up in spring and stays hot all summer, and it's brutally windy. The locals, when they saw the design of that school, they're like, idiots. The design was like this, very last minute. I think at lunch, I heard I have to make the design so that I submit it by 6 o'clock in the evening for some grant funding. And this is what kind of how I planned it. Tiny forest and the bioswale that catches water from the parking lot and the path in between so that students get kind of channels to not walking through the forest. And the cross section, so this is all in a slope. The bioswale contains this, I call it a sausage. You'll see later what it is. It's a drainage pipe with gravel wrapped in a filter fabric. And then we use logs. I wanted cedar logs, but we got much bigger ones. And then we put in some soil here and added mulch and planted into it. We got free services to donate some of the leftover logs that they are piling up for their big Christmas bonfire. And they gave us a bunch of big logs for free, which was fantastic. They also gave us a bunch of mulch. They had new mulch and older mulch. You can see kind of the color, so we could use the older mulch as composted mulch and mix it with soil. Yeah, all of this was a lot of pretty heavy equipment. And then we had McCartney's, also Wiarton Landscaping Company, who built that in a day. They got the excavators out. They basically had the filter fabric. They corrected me on my design a couple of times, and they asked them, please, if you were the guys. So they actually did a fantastic job. And they basically put out this filter fabric, filled it, first put in the pipe, then filled in gravel, then folded it cut so that it's actually a sausage, about 100 meters long. And this brings that catches the water and then brings it towards the tiny pond. So it's basically two projects at once. Bioswale is not part of the official tiny forest trade mark. And they put the trees down and did a fantastic job there as well. So they just placed them there as a kind of like a headspace, and then also for the students to sit on. We are looking at a track. Actually, here was always the mud path that collected the water. That was the idea for the bioswale, because it was always wet and annoyed the school and everybody. So we were like, maybe we can solve that and kind of give the school something positive. And at the end of the day, when McCartney was ready, it looked like this. So he had padded it together. We had about this much material, which isn't as much as we were supposed to be 2 feet. We had maybe 1.5. We're a little bit under trademark requirements, but there was also some soil underneath, so I think we're okay. And then we organized rugby, and we had, I had ordered trees from the Conservation Authority even before we had any of the grants. This is always the critical thing. The grant funding is you get the money then and you have to spend it by then. The pre-ordering is here. So you have to kind of, in the end, take a risk there and say it'll come over. And we then had about maybe 500 trees from the Conservation Authority. And those got planted with a bunch of helpers. This is actually the second work bee, which are not mostly adults. A lot of the Buggy Tail Water Alliance came with 8 people. That's here in very nice group and very spiritually supportive of this entire endeavor. And we planted a lot of maples. We taught children how to plant. So we involved the teachers, and basically the teachers taught children, and then a lot of kids, like probably 100 kids, planted their first ever tree. And that was kind of a very heart-moving moment for me to just see and the ownership that kids took in that. We were trying to do a wind fence. That's a longer story that I'll come to later. But here you can see just a bunch of school kids watering and running around with mulch. And I guess they were supposed to plant, water, and mulch. That was the task. So they had to do several things at once, and they had to compact it, and then we had to go through and repad it, because if you've never planted a tree, that's not as easy. And it was a pretty happening place. This was early May. And the kids were very excited. We put a lot of pylons because that creates the feeling of safety. So there was like one guy who permanently moved that pylon, but great. Watering, and once it was all done, we still had to add more water manually in buckets. So Natasha, like Wendy, she kind of felt like the water walker. I think she carried hundreds of buckets. And we added mulch everywhere, like about this high. So that keeps the weeds down and also the moisture. And we put this really nice wind fence out around, which the school safety people totally did not like. They had that disaster waiting to happen. And once I saw the kids, I was a little bit critical, but once I saw the kids and using stones and throwing rocks at each other, I'm like, maybe those spears, those T-bar spears. And so we were trying, oh, we also planted a few larger trees. This is I think, they can see what that is. Um, but we mostly had little trees, saplings, 1 or 2 years old, but a few were larger, just to create the feeling of green. And what the heck do we do with the snow fence? That was one of my biggest questions, because we were asked to take it out from the Blue Water District School Board. It was otherwise really supportive. But this safety is important. And so I was trying to, with the traditional fence, we could have just done a whole lot of them. They didn't like that. It's too dangerous. But it's not traditional here, but still. And then what we ended up, it was beautiful. And what we ended up, oh, we marked each tree. So once they were planted, there's trees everywhere. Once we were planted, we had a killing week after planting. All of our maples died. All of them died, and they're still not. We've replanted a few, but that was a pretty rough one. But otherwise, most trees survived, and even the Carolinian ones, which are most heavily hit, they're all. We had a nice formal opening with the school, where we invited the entire school together, like the school board and all the community partners, and a few other schools actually attended. And then I had this idea to seed down sorghum Sudan grass, which I think didn't make the watering. It was a really dry area, but sorghum Sudan grass can grow like this within 4 weeks. And I thought maybe that gives shade to the more sun-sensitive trees, and also like some wind protection. This is brutal. It's like putting a blow dryer to the plant. And but it eventually came. So what you can see here is this is where the biosphere, the sausage is. So this is where that sorghum Sudan grass actually did fairly well. But if you go a little further, you see that it's tiny. It's tiny, like with this, and it didn't do much for the wind. So the lesson there is actually it's a really good method to create wind protection and shade in a natural way, but you do have to irrigate it in a dry cover. These are like ones around. We ended up planting hybrid poplars, which don't belong into a tiny forest, but they are a really good fast developing plant, and you can cut them down. So we kind of figured let's not just do late succession trees that all kind of need shade, but let's combine the different species and work with the faster growing trees. Sumac we banned to an end because we don't want this to be one sumac infestation. But also it does grow faster, and it does create shade, and that's a big problem. You can see here how exposed it is. This is the south, and the wind comes from this side, from the west. The formal inauguration was really well attended. The mayor or acting mayor from South First Peninsula was there. The super lieutenant from the Blue Water District School Board was there. A lot of funder representatives. We did a lot of kids were there who were kind of excited about this entire thing. The principal or the vice principal, she really earned my respect by asking us to ask for, she said, do not ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And because if you need to first run everything for safety, that is like a 4-week wait window, and then it comes back with some absurdity and it goes back and forth. What we did is we were doing our best people knew we are a community, so we wouldn't run away because we want to work with the Blue Water District School Board in the future. So those community connections were really, really valuable. And here you can see the sort of Sudan grass, how it's here, it's too short, it's kind of yellowish under water stress. But up there in the back, it's mighty. And if we would have everything at that scale, then this would be the perfect way to protect young pine trees. And they just create biomass. You just, like in spring, I went over with a machete and like took 15 minutes to take it all down. People were generally very happy with this work, also with the work piece, because it's kind of cool doing stuff, physical labor together. It doesn't feel like this art work that we rather have people from other countries do. But it's actually something that creates art feelings and true connection within the community and to the land. And I think that was something that I find very important, that physical labor is actually fun if you do it right, if you do it safe, if you don't overdo it. So organizing physical labor is something that I found very inspiring also to in the end, we have this body-mind disconnect that's at the root of our value disconnect with the land. So I think we really have to start with these physical labor issues and make it a happy thing for kids to do. Most kids, when they heard, oh, you want us to work, they wanted to run away because somehow people think that it's fun to go into a gym and do this, but it's really, really, you don't do this in the garden because that's something which is, traditionally has been done by slaves and then machines. And that is part of our value system, why regeneration is so difficult. And so for me, this was like just practicing regeneration and practice or experiencing the values of regeneration with children, with community, and with teachers, with educators. One little thing, once we had it all done, we learned, oh shoot, the parking lot is actually poorly designed and it drained not where the biosphere is, but 15 meters further. And that creates all the mud down there. So once it was all done, we had to extend the drainage pipe so we can actually catch the water. And again, we didn't ask for permission, we asked for forgiveness, because that would have been another cascade of permission to the school board. And again, of course, we talked with them before, so they would know what we're doing, but we did it informally without the officials. And I think that is the big lesson that I learned, is if you have those relationships with the people in the school, and there's this trust relationship, then this project is doable. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to match the timelines. Because in the end, the timeline that matters most is the life of plants. And they don't really care about application procedures or grant reporting deadlines or spending deadlines. They just grow or die. And so that was really tricky. We also have a few signs that didn't make it into the tiny forest in spring, but this is like we have 3 signs: a simple sign on biodiversity, a more complex sign on healthy water cycle, and how a disrupted watershed versus a healthy watershed keeps cool. And the third one that tries to talk about this: climate landscapes are cool, or vegetated landscapes are cool. That makes the linkage to climate change and climate resilience also. So those signs will go up to the school. They are also available for everybody. So if anybody wants to do another tiny forest, you can just use our signs for free. They are just downloadable at high resolution. Like our graphic designer was very open with that, and why reinvent the wheel there. Yeah, we had some good publicity, and the project, this is before and after, is actually a fairly substantial, it's the biggest tiny forest in America. So tiny forest use the bioswale. And yeah, I hope that other people will use that experience and just say, hey, this is something cool. We're going to do that at our school or at our municipal building or at our church. Ethiopian churches are hiding themselves in harboring biodiversity. They're actually famous, those forest churches. It's worth looking at it. And then you look at local churches which seem to pride themselves in destroying biodiversity with all these huge lawns around them. Like maybe we can do some development collaboration and send them some money so they can do some fencing around there. And then they can teach us why it is spiritually so important to foster biodiversity even in our spiritual communities. Thank you to a lot of funders. The Huron Forever funded us, funded the Bioswale through Stewardship Great Roots. Friends of the Environment funded through the school directly. The Rotary Club gave us a tech with no strings attached. And we didn't have to tell them what we use it for, which was great because you always have stuff that doesn't work with the rigid granting timeline. So really, really good if you find a partner like that. Regenerate Great Roots is a project of the sustainability project, so I'm very grateful for the board and all the support that we got. And thank you for your time and attention.
Thorsten, it's great the way you've done this. I really appreciate the connection to the broader issues of climate by which you introduced the project, but the project itself is really inspiring and fantastic. So, I know people have a bunch of questions. I'm going to go in the kitchen and see if I can make some tea.
All right.
It's done. Done. All right. Question for Thorsten.
How do we ask questions?
Idea of the tiny forest came first or the location? Like, did you see the opportunity and then think about the tiny forest, or were you on the idea?
The idea was not from me. The idea was from Lee Grigg, and I think he and many other people in the community wondered, what can we do about this Wiarton school to make it less ugly and less like the climate on the school ground is unbearable. Either windy in winter, it's brutally windy. There's no wind shade whatsoever. And in this summer, it's just brutally exposed. So this used to be a scar for many years. And the guy who helped us with the extension, the last 15 meters of the pipe extension, he actually lived inside of the school and he grew up there. He was an older guy, and yeah, he was saying when they built this school, all the locals were like, God, this is going to be horrible. And so no, this idea of doing something there, I think, is quite old. The tiny forest momentum came up when A, we had this idea of the tiny forest. B, we had a teacher in the school who was willing to take it on. You need somebody in the inside to also talk with the janitors and the snow blowing people and like move all of those things out. And then I had time to commit to fundraising, which in the end was the difference between talking and doing. So for Regenerate Great Bruce, when we had our biggest successes when we just supported existing community initiatives and just gave them time. And so we had some way to direct, but in the end, it was the community who was in charge. But nobody can do more than, as a volunteer, more than a bite or two. And this required like 10 bites at the same time. So if nobody is paid to do that, I just don't happen. I don't know. There's tentative a few ideas. I think the most likely is that the acting CAO from Georgian Blood said, I'm going to put this tiny forest, no bioswale. We're going to put one right in front of the municipal building from Georgian Bluffs. And they already started planting trees, and he's on it. So, and it's $10,000 for municipalities in the end, not that big. And the symbolic, I think the symbolic value of those demonstration projects is quite valuable. I hope that different Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, like service clubs, will see how great it is to engage with children and youth and do something that through one symbolic act brings together a lot of the big thinking. I'm a big scale thinker, as you may have noticed, but I think bringing it into the concrete and keeping that relationship and the reminder of the big world, the big impact. I think this is it's a really powerful project.
I got a message here, a question here. Thorsten, you predicted that the Wiarton area would be in the Carolinian zone 20 years from now. What is the basis of your statement?
It's global warming. 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 will be the full El Nino year. It may be even hotter than 2023. And like Carolina is just 200 kilometers. There's some prediction that ecozones move by 1,000 kilometers. So I'm not sure if Carolinian is actually, or whether we should go to Kentucky. That's my. So Carolinian is, I think, socially acceptable without creating a havoc in the school children, because you don't want to, like, you have to be a balance between being realistic and loving.
Group chat members, just type in your questions, please.
No, we didn't plant palm trees. We spent, like Carolinian, you mean, or general? We planted about 50. So I'm not sure if I remember all of them, but we basically looked at whatever was available at the Conservation Authority. In the end, a lot of it I ordered and it didn't get delivered. We didn't have any bur oaks. We didn't have, like there were quite a few that were just out. We ordered from St. William's Nursery. That was mostly the Carolinian ones, and they were larger and more expensive. Tulip trees, Kentucky coffee trees, but only like 2 or so. Like Czech bar hickories, those were smaller and we had more of them, but a lot of them will die. That's just the nature of planting Czech bar hickories. We have a lot of oaks, red oaks, just because those are, I think, robust, both Carolinian and local.
Oh, that's good.
There's a few trees that I wanted to plant, which we didn't get. And maybe this year we'll spend a few $100s just to add more trees.
Do you know why the maples died?
Frost. heavy frost, and they were too far off, too far out. So if they would have been planted 2 weeks earlier, they would have made it. And that's part of this story of timing. We got all of our grants somewhere in end of March. So I already had ordered the trees, or some of the trees. Then looked what's left at St. William's, because that was a big budget item that I didn't want to take a risk on. And then we had to find a contractor. And they said, well, no, yeah, in August. So actually, I was really, really grateful because McCartney, who did it for us, or actually, I had a verbal approval by some other guy, and then he bailed on me. And McCartney's son goes to the school, and McCartney also does snow removal at the school. And so, because he is local and he knows how ugly this schoolyard is, he was very happy to do this job. And it was kind of nice to see that landscapers, they tend to be the destroyers with their excavators. And I think it was actually a really joyful project to do regeneration work. And that's one thing that I thought, if we are serious about ecosystem regeneration, the landscapers are our allies, because there's a lot of business in creating ponds and creating like uneven ground and bioswales and all of that. So yes, landscaping is really important. It's fun for landscapers because they enjoy being on the regenerative side of things. And in the end, it doesn't matter where they get their hours paid, whether it's for doing more asphalt or doing like tiny forest.
So a tiny forest, it can be planted, the trees can be planted all at once, like, or can you, is there a schedule like you would prefer the populars first and then whatever? Is it what the like the intent to plant it all at once?
Actually, a good question, because some trees are shade loving, and I think with experience, I think what I would do over time is I would strategically plant shade trees, and then the next year add the shade-loving trees, and then 5 years from now I would kill the shade trees again. So being more intentional, dealing with this really harsh sunlight here. I believe that the trademark came from Netherlands, where the climate is much more moderate, much more cloudy, and they don't have those scorching hot July or August, whatever. Or this year it was May, June, July. So we have to adopt the planting strategy a little bit, and yeah, it's. I think in the end, it's good to have a native plant tree person on your team who can decide what's best to plant how. But I was surprised the Czech hickories actually did quite good. And they are the most susceptible ones to the sun.
What's the total timeline for this project to date? So when did you, so to speak, break ground on it? Obviously a lot of preparation leading up to that, but from that point to now, how long has that been?
Grant writing was fall, tree ordering winter, grant receiving in spring, getting all the design and landscaping work lined up was basically then, like it's all in spring. So, and you want to get your plants in the ground actually end of April. We were a couple of weeks late. Then the trees are further back, and it's much easier to replant them. Another time when you can plant really well is actually November. The problem is getting cheap trees, because the Conservation Authority trees are by far like $2.50 for a sapling versus $30 from a small nursery.
Oh,
So the conservation authority is really where you can access like bulk trees at a good price. And yeah, that's so we planted in May, and we had a last planting actually in November, when we added willows, dogwoods, new maples, and just some other random trees. Some silver maples. Not sure if that was a good thing.
How long do you intend to be involved with the garden?
I think it'll be a 3-year volunteering project until that is over. And I think most people think, oh, that's horrible, 3 years of commitment. No, this is actually what we need to learn. Ecosystems need dedication, and it's like raising a child.
Food Trail has forested small area down in Carroll Bay,
Yes.
but they focus on shrubs and native trees that would be food for
Yes.
for
Yes.
100%.
Yes. And that's again, schools are different than Bruce Trail, because in a school, if you have apple trees, apples are fantastic objects. B, they are attracting lots of stinging insects that create allergies, and you don't want that on a school. So a food garden is a different thing. I wouldn't do that on a schoolyard. I would stay away from fruits. Berries, another thing that can be toxic. I am not sure that the kids are educated to know what is toxic and what isn't. And so I think safety of thinking is important. Actually wrote in, there's 4 newsletters on the tiny forest, and safety in school is a difficult thing because schoolyards are as safe as possible from a infrastructure, and then kids are just so bored that they beat the heck out of each other. But that's not the school's fault. That's not the school's liability. You can blame a parent. And from a liability perspective, that's the real big problem, how we have embraced this as safe as possible mentality. A lot of the outdoor educators, they advocate for as safe as necessary. The safety inspector, when they saw the logs, is like, oh my God, the kids are gonna climb on them. They're gonna walk on them. And when the kids came out, first thing they did is they ran on the trees. But it's like, yeah, they're kids. I mean, they're supposed to run on, like, so that's not a problem. This is something which kids need to learn, and if kids can't balance on a stump like this big, that's not the stem's fault. And so this is something that I learned, is that yes, working with the school board, but also explaining, there's only so much we can do for kids and safety. Like, been thinking a lot about autism in the last years, partly because my family's background, myself and my daughter. Autistic people's brains need stimulation. If you want to torture them, you put them on an empty lot, and you can be sure that the person will turn into aggressive monsters. And so creating schoolyards that are as safe as possible is really not fair towards a lot of children.
While those trees are growing quickly, they're going to be eating up a lot of parking, right?
Yes.
And so have you projected, when they will peak out and stop really drawing down carbon?
To be honest, in terms of carbon money, this is not a carbon sequestration project. All the volunteers have been driving way more when this project will ever draw down carbon. And I think it's really important to, like, I had this discussion about a pollinator patch, like, oh yeah, maybe we can use carbon credits. And I calculated it's about 5 cents of carbon credit. If the carbon credit gets a 200 values per ton, $200 per ton, which it doesn't. So we're talking cents on a square meter basis. And in a tiny port, like that's a pretty big project, but still, if you do one trip to Ottawa, you'll need that. You need a lot of tiny forests for restoring. They're tiny. But I think from a testing perspective, or educational perspective, you can monitor the fungal activity in the soil. You can, like, what you saw is that the bioswale of the sausage created real good growth in the sorghum Sudan grass, and then it fell off. As the mycorrhiza in the soil will connect, what will happen is that the mycorrhiza will transport the water. So instead of having water just at the bottom of the bioswale, it will draw it much further up. And that's something which I think we should really monitor, because it can teach us how the Wood Wide Web works and collaborates and shares resources. So those things I think are really educational. Yeah. Carbon cycles. People always think carbon gets stored away, locked away like gold. But that's not what carbon or life does. Life is cycles. And by cycling more rapidly, it also creates more, it holds more carbon in its cycle. So we want the cycling, we want the rotting, we want the release, and we want the growth. We want it all. Want it all. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.